thank you for squeezing into this room. This is a very happy thing because there are so many people who want to see Danny Dorling. But you must also feel a little bit like sardines. But thank you for being sardines with us. It's a real honour to have Danny Dorling here with us tonight. Yes, we've got 2 glasses of wine. We're doing table service now, so that's just Danny is Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford, but better known to many of us, especially us booksellers, as the author of a number of books such as Shattered Nation and Inequality and the 1%, that have formed a kind of crucial canon of reading for those of us who are trying to grapple with what is happening in our country today. His latest book, 7 Children, manages to be both deeply troubling and completely brilliant. It demonstrates Danny's remarkable aptitude to bring into the light something that we've been keeping in the dark for far too long. What he calls Britain's double crisis of very high and stagnant inequality and ever-growing poverty. It feels like by looking at 7 children that represent the spectrum of income inequality in the UK today, by breathing life into the shocking statistics that their stories are woven out of, only then can we really understand the human reality that always lies beneath the numbers. And that is something that all of us must do. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Danny Dorling.
Okay, thank you for coming along tonight. I'll try and do this in just over half an hour because I'm interested in what you're going to ask me. This is the first talk I've given about this book. The website went live this morning, so you can find that. They've printed copies. You can actually get them from Hearst, I think. Now you get them here tonight. It's exciting for me because I thought it would never happen, which may sound odd because I've published a lot of books, but almost all non-fiction books. I published one fiction book called The 32 Stops, and this book is different in that it's a mixture of fiction and non-fiction. And the reason I tried to do it was that non-fiction only gets through to a certain proportion of people. It's incredibly numbing. You can read the most terrible statistic and it doesn't affect you, it has no emotion. But the stories of actual people, just a few paragraphs of actual lives, do affect us. And so if you're trying to get through what is happening, you have to present it in a different way. Now, I have no idea if I've succeeded. All I've succeeded on is persuading editor number 50 to take on the project and edit it and for them to take a risk and print it. The scary thing is that so many people looked at earlier drafts of this and just went, no. So it may just be terrible. I'm going to find out. I'm very nerdy. I do stats. The book is simple. An introduction, 7 chapters named after the 7 children. You'll see my kind of nerdiness coming out. I like things in order. Hence A, B, C, D, E, G. Girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy. It's easy to remember. I might try and explain later. Monday's child, Tuesday's child. You'll know the rhyme. It's not so much that. I suppose I should explain why 7. It's the kind of minimum number you need to describe the distribution and what's going on. The answer in the book as to why 7 is that since 1994, every year the government have published in March about 30 statistical spreadsheets. Each spreadsheet can contain up to a dozen mini spreadsheets. This is households below average income. The Secretary of State stands up in Parliament, tries to pick, or their officials, they don't do any of this, their officials pick something that isn't terrible, and they say last year the number of pensioners below the absolute 2005 level of poverty decreased. Our government is successful. And that goes on and on and on. You won't remember the release of the latest March figures because the newspapers get bored about it. They do report it. You know, 1/3 of children living in poverty. These are the official figures. Why 7? Households below average income, based on the Family Resources Survey, divides all households into fifths, 5 equal groups containing the same number of people in the country. The poorest fifth of households contains 28% of all children. 28% is double 14%. 14% is a seventh. The poorest fifth of households contains 2 out of 7 children. The next fifth of households in the UK contains 28% of children. That's 2 out of 7. Suddenly you have 4 out of 7 children in the poorest 40% of society. If you don't look at it like that, the country looks a hell of a lot better. We've squeezed our children into the poorest families. And then there is a 7th child in the middle, a 7th in the penultimate fifth, and a 7th in the best of fifth. And that's why 7 children. But it allows you to have one in the middle. He's called David in this case. I know these children. In my mind, these children are real, not in yours. And we can begin to look at the differences. Can anybody spot why I was annoyed when they showed me the book cover and wouldn't alter it? If you can't, I'll be happy. 8 bars, yeah. 8 bars. Right, and this is the difference in the world of publishing. In fact, this book was interesting over the amount of detail they went into about my exact wording, the grammar, how are my prejudices coming through. I was edited largely by, I think, women in their 30s would be my guess, which is great if you're a man in his 50s, because they do point out different things. And a whole lot of other people read the book and commented. They were incredibly about words, not a single comment about any of the numbers. You can just tell, because they're English graduates, they just skip over them. And I was told so, I shouldn't, it's like, lovely, lovely people. But this is why non-fiction doesn't work. Right? You don't look at numbers. I was told that the cover design balances nicely. So what I say is that 8th bar is how many's like Boris Johnson's. Okay, if you want to, and it goes way higher than that. Let's give you some more slides and click through more quickly. And we talk about Anna. And I'm going to try reading. The bar graph, there are 11 figures in the book. The bar graph is showing you the annual disposable income. I know most of you can't see it, but don't worry, you're tuned not to be interested in it. Right? You're interested in people. It's the annual disposable income after tax, after benefit, after housing costs, equivalized to the size of the family. Lost you all. The bottom, the poorest child, you're looking about 6 grand a year. I'll show you in a minute exactly how much. Second child's family, third, fourth in the middle, they're just touching on the disposable income. This is money for food. Quite why food isn't included as an essential, I don't know. Housing is 20,000. Gemma, up there, 50,000. That's £25,000 per parent of income a year after tax and benefits and after paying for housing. So if you've got a family and your family are bringing in more than £50,000 a year, you're better off than our 7th child. Here there are 100 children, and so we have 6 children before we have our first typical child. Then we have a dozen the next and so on, and then there are 6 children above Gemma. So I'm not talking about the extremes of society, although those 6 children above Gemma, and this was the household I grew up in a household way back in the 60s and 70s that was 1, 2, maybe 3%. But we weren't as greedy, we weren't allowed to be as greedy then. Now, the families of those 6 children at the top are taking a third of all the income of all the families of children in Britain every year. Right? It goes above Gemma's level. If you want, I'm giving you the kind of punchline of the book. Where you read it, you get this, I'm spoiling it for you, but you're expecting child number 7 to be well off, and they are well off, of course, statistically they are. Mum and Dad are running a corner shop. They run it well. After they pay for the mortgage on their flat, which is mostly paid off, they have £50,000 a year. to spend, which is a fortune compared to what Anna has. But I don't feel well off. I'll read it out to try to explain. And we're going back to the poorest child. This isn't a child who ever uses food banks. That's only 1 or 2% of children. This isn't a child who's going to have to sofa surf. This isn't a child who's going to get rickets. This is just your typical child. Or another way to look at it, there were 14 million children born in 2018. No, there were 14 million children under 18 in 2018, which is when this book begins. You divide 14 million by 7, you get 2 million. You line all the children up by income, you take the poorest 2 million, and you take the one bang in the middle. And that's Anna. Right. Their poverty matters more to Anna's mum than to a little girl, who has absolutely no idea that they are poor. It will be how poverty affects her mum that in turn most affects Anna. In the circumstances when Anna's mum would mutter, "We're fucked and I can't see a way out," observers like me, and now this is a quote, not from me, I think it may be the Institute for Fiscal Studies. This is how people like me normally write. Whereas just under a tenth of women aged 18 to 24 were suffering anxiety in 2008, only 10 years later that proportion had tripled to be just under a third, while the proportion affected by it who were aged 25 to 34, Anna's mum's age, has more than doubled in those 10 years, from less to a tenth to over a fifth. I'm trying to change the way I speak, but you can see it washes over you. Oh, anxiety doubled. Terrible, but back to the fiction. And the words here actually come from round about £1 a week, which was published in 1913, on families in Lambeth, typical respectable working class families in 1913 living on about £1 a week. And the observers of those families, the Fabian women who did the survey, noticed that some mothers had their nerves shattered to fiddle strings. They were on edge all the time. This is 111 years ago. Today, temperaments have been worn to fiddle strings, and more so as time gone on. Sometimes it might be the smallest of things, like Anna losing an item of clothing her mum has bought for her, or someone knocking over the pots of seedlings they put out on the landing. Events that make everything feel, and I've just cut. Right? So I've been trying to take anecdote, observation, what people tell me, and numbers, and turning anxiety into something meaningful. Let's try and go forward. Brandon, I'm only going to give you one table. There's hardly any tables in the book. You'll be glad to know, because I want people to read the book. And who's going to flick through a book that's got tables in and buy it? Okay, we will. I'm very grateful to you. My other books only exist because of you. Text from the book. When Brandon was born in 2018, the 95th percentile of individual adults had an annual income before tax of £78,500. Those numbers might make you think that an annual salary that goes on of £80,000 puts you in the top 5%. It doesn't. It puts you much higher than that, because 43% of all adults don't pay income tax. 43%. Pensioners, students, low income. So yeah, 78,500 means you're in the top 5% of adults of that 57% who pay tax. In other words, that man on Question Time who said that 80 grand wasn't rich was much better off than they even described him as they try to explain what the real distribution is. Right? We don't have a clue. We don't have a clue. Our social statistics are so complicated. And the way they're described is that even the commentators who criticise the people who say that they're not rich are actually getting their criticism wrong. And it's because it's boring. It's boring trying to understand all of these things. I had to make up these 7 families. I discovered that's really, really hard. Non-fiction's incredibly easy, because there is a truth. I'm old-fashioned academic. Right? There is a truth, just one. And your sentences can either be true or false. Your data is either right or wrong. You're either, doing it rightly. Non-fiction, you have to make up a world. The trick, if ever you do this, is do it really carefully, do it once and don't change it. Anyway, they had to have the national average number of siblings, so there they are. These are their weekly incomes after housing costs and so on. This is how much money you have a week to clothe, feed, travel, everything else for the children. When people like me say we have the highest income inequality in all of Europe, and we beat Portugal in 2009, and now we're kind of tying with Bulgaria, but we think we've beaten them, we've become first. What high income inequality means is big gaps between those numbers. Kind of like, of course, right? So it shouldn't be shocking. In Western Europe, we've had the highest income inequality for 15 years, but we don't tend to know what that means. Let's go forward again, because as you know, we've got 7 children to get through. I try and touch on other things. I worry about it. This is Candice. Now, we've only got up now to the bottom of the second quintile of the income distribution. If you remember that, 2 children, 1, 1, 1, 7 children fitting into the 5. So Candice is officially poor. But they're doing much better than Anna and Brandon. This is about Candice's mum. Whenever she goes out of her flat, Candice's mother appears to draw an invisible cloak around her, a shield. She smiles and nods at some neighbours, like the retired teachers 2 doors down, who always make a fuss over the girls. But she's also always careful. The further she gets away from their home, the less space on the pavement she takes up. She automatically steps out of the way of the people she thinks of as above her, especially men in suits. But it isn't just them. It's most people she defers to. She calls it being polite. She keeps her eyes downwards. She's done this for far so long that she is hardly aware that she does it. But we're all hardly aware of how our glances are a product of the society we live in. Little note 20. Over a third of the book is little notes at the back. They let me do that. 2 studies. Hundreds and hundreds of studies and anecdotes. And you might know, I'm fairly sure that the most famous observation about where people put their eyes is George Orwell's From Homage to Catalonia, about when waiters first looked him in the eye, and the shock of what it's like when you look people in the eye. We're very careful. I'm careful because I put this up because I'm quite shy, but we are extremely careful about where we look with our eyes. It's all about respect, subservience, and not and how you go. I'm going to zoom through because I'm determined not to go on and on. We've got our middle child, David. Here's their incomes. Now remember that a third of all the income, and this is only of families with children, because it's families. My youngest, I'm never going to tell you, I never talk about my family, but my youngest is now over 18. I don't have children anymore in terms of under 17. I'm not a comparable family, I'm taken out of this. This is just families with children under 18. A third of all of it, which is half of that pie, is already taken by the richest 6%. This is what's left, and it's how what is left is distributed. So Gemma and Emily, they're slightly less Emily and Freddie, they're living on the same as the first 3 children. But none of these are extravagant. You might think, how on earth can they do it? How can they do it? How are they paying for the heating? How are they feeding? What are they feeding their children? David's family were poorer a few years ago. And so his older sister, qualifies for free school meals. And because of the way the legislation works, she doesn't lose her qualification, even though they're now the middle one. And I'll summarise this rather than read it out. It's a true story. I can't say where the true story comes from. But in a particular local authority in this country, the free school meal service is set up such that if in the cafeteria that you go to as a child, you do not pick exactly the right food, which you're not told, then you are asked for some money. And the story I was told was of a girl who became thin because of the way the free school meal system was happening. And this is the middle. There as you said earlier, the book can appear quite depressing. I mean, you're kind of stuck. We're at our highest inequality since the 1930s. We have hunger returned. We've got absolute immiseration. Things have got worse. So, of course, it's going to be depressing in places. I do try and put hope into it. And now we're kind of getting to the easy bit, right? We've gone past the average. These are the better off typical children. Again, taking them at absolutely equal intervals along the income scale, right? Which is not what 7-Up did. If any of you can remember 7-Up, which was brilliant, and they're still alive, there's going to be another one. They picked some boys from a very posh pre-prep in London, i.e. in the top 0.5%, and some others from a school for homeless kids or some orphanage, because they were doing it in the 1950s. When we were so equal, it would have been really boring, unless they picked the extremes of society. And then you get nice stories about how they looked after themselves later and so on. Today, you don't have to pick the extremes. The extremes are from different planets. It wouldn't make any sense. I mean, it'd just be a silly program. Today, if you're doing 7-Up, you could literally just pick 7 typical children and you would have a story, because we're so unequal, a story of different lives. Why are things so bad? The little red line shows it there. Our real incomes on average were highest in 2008. We have a banking crisis. They shoot down. Pay actually went down, bit of inflation. We had a bit, it's not a recovery. We never got back up to 2008. And just at the point when we almost did get back to 2008, like this, back to cost of living crisis. And suddenly we're way down, right? So the last time this has happened, none of you are going to remember it, because I don't know how you make a talk like this entertaining when you're doing, but the last time something as bad as this happened in terms of living standard stagnation was 1798 to 1822, right? So, and it's only because Britain has the longest records in the world that we have a worse time. Right, it is bad. Again, I'm not going to read out, but with the key point, if you were to read, is that Emily's dad is driving tourist buses, getting £27,000 a year, and Emily's mum works in a supermarket doing a basic supermarket job. Better off than average. And there are fun things happening in the lives of all these children. Maybe this is the most depressing graph, except it isn't. It's a brilliant graph. This is the United Nations official latest December 2023 survey of poverty in every country that they study, which is mainly rich countries, and the change in 7 years, there's lots of sevens in the book, up to 2021. Poland, over a third of poverty for children disappeared in Poland in just 7 years. Right, remittances, Slovenia, Latvia, Lithuania, Korea even, if you remember Parasite and so on, think about inequality in Korea. Estonia, Canada has done incredibly well. Canada's almost as equal as Sweden, by the way, at the moment. Right, there's so many good news stories in the world. Portugal, Croatia, look at Japan, look at Ireland, right? Huge drops in child poverty. And you can see where I'm getting to, because you just look at the top, and that's us. I mean, honestly, in terms of spectacularly, right, not even just on the edge of getting it wrong, right, world-leading stupidity, callousness, nastiness, whatever kind of Tory endgame we went through, is measured in this kind of thing. And the countries just beneath, who've got rises, but not as big as ours, Iceland, France, Switzerland, Norway, Austria, Germany, they already have much lower child poverty than us. So they've had a little rise, much smaller than ours, but we were worse, and we've got worse faster. Right? It really is... Well, I'm absolutely sure I won't be doing this in 5 or 10 years' time. I hope I'm going to be alive. It's impossible that we can do any worse than this. It's almost impossible. It takes so much effort to do so badly, to increase how bad it is for children. You have to go out of your way. You know, you have to go, oh, let's not pay the third child benefit and let's keep that because we can't afford it. I mean, it's... and that will alter in a year. And of course, it's all different here. Right. And I won't read out again. This was me having a pop at 28 up, which was incredibly... I won't talk about Oliver. But TV documentaries, hard-hitting real-life TV documentaries, tend to either concentrate on the very, very well-off and often present them as normal when they're not. So very well-off media commentators can think that they're average middle class or do poverty porn. Whereas you're forced when you do this. You finally got to Gemma. And I have a whole section of politics in Gemma's chapter, partly because her father likes GB News, which makes the chapter more interesting. Not because she's the fifth, but because eventually you want to talk about politics in a book. My life used to be quite tricky when it came to describing what was going on. I used to have to do complicated things about what was happening to the relative gaps between people, and this was all about Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and saying that they weren't doing as well as they thought they were doing. Now it's easy. Now all we have to do is measure children. We just have to measure the height of children, and it's going down. Average height is going down. In the States as well, by the way. If you want to feel good, the States is worse than us. But it's only the States. Everywhere across Europe and in the world, children's heights still rise. Germany does a slight dip. When you remember that, I think she was 14, maybe she was 15. The girl who cried in front of Angela Merkel, my favourite, the Syrian girl who cried in front of Angela. And she let in 1.5 million Syrians, many, many of them children. Huge boost to the German economy. German population is still peaking this year. This year, 2024, will be the highest that Germany ever reaches. It's downhill forever now, because populations are going down in most of the world. Anyway, Germany let in 1.5 million Syrians, to the great benefit of Germany, to the great benefit of the Syrians, and the average height of children dropped slightly because the Syrian kids are shorter for 1 year. We didn't let in many people. We don't do that. We do obsession with small boats. Really, really frightening small boats. Do you know about how many there are? And they're all marching up here to get to Edinburgh, anyway. Hence Gemma's dad and GB News. Right? And that's our height. It starts, the turn is 2010. And children of age 5 in 2010 just beginning to get shorter. And that matters because the nutrition was getting worse between 2005 and 10. Right? So, in hindsight, the Labour government knew Labour were wonderful, but they weren't quite as wonderful in that, you were actually beginning to get a plateauing and a falling in the heights of children because you can't eat a Sure Start centre, put it that way. In France, they're going up. Very, very close to the end, and amazingly almost on time. That's the website for the book. You don't have to note it down, or if you just Google me and find my website as of lunchtime, thanks to Kirsty today. The book website is up. Lots and lots of evidence behind, because although Fraser Nelson used to run a competition in The Spectator every year to get interns, and one of the questions 3 years in a row was find 3 mistakes that Professor Danny Dorling has made, which is great. It's actually really, and I've written to him twice now and just saying, could you just let me know what they were? Anyway, it's personal. So, I mean, there will be mistakes in the book. So we have a website, we have animation. The children don't have a race or ethnicity or religion. You might try to guess it. You can ask about the names, the rest of the construct. I've talked to you for almost too much, but I have kept the time, which I'm very proud of myself to doing. This is just highest inequality in Europe. But if you want to be optimistic, I know you can't see the countries, these are European countries. Look, it is sloping down slightly. Inequality is falling over time in most of Europe. Inequality is falling in much of the world. Somebody like me should write a good news book about those incredible falls in child poverty in Eastern Europe recently. Right? But we feel an obligation to obviously write about the worst things, particularly if the worst things are happening in the place that you live. But don't be depressed, not least because of good news in the rest of the world, but almost certainly this is as bad as it can get. And these children, when they're grandparents, and given the age will change, in about 80 years' time, maybe 70, will tell stories about what it was like to live in the terrible 2020s and what an unbelievable situation. And can you believe we had that? And when we went hungry and when we went cold. But very likely, in the remaining years of their life, things will get better every year. Because this is what happened 100 years ago. 1918 was the peak of inequality in the past. For children born in 1918, even though the 20s had just a 10-year cost of living crisis, and the 30s had mass unemployment, they grew taller. Then they got a welfare state in 1945. They were young enough they didn't have to go and fight in the Second World War. They entered the labour market in full employment. Houses were built and they could start a family at age 25. They entered their pensionable years just as new labour was chucking money into the health service and they could get operations. Right? So we've had a generation in the past who started off at the worst time, which is where we like now, and saw the best of times through. That's entirely possible, but it doesn't happen by sitting there and going, oh, I hope that happens. Right? It is Labour MPs telling the Cabinet, we didn't do all of this to become an MP just so that children could go hungry because you've got some macho thing about the two children. Oh, incidentally, do you want to guess which country, the UK, the children aren't getting shorter? Scotland, the children are getting taller every year. So that's the UK figure, including Scotland. If we could get Scotland out, unsurprisingly, the Department for Health is reticent to release the data on heights. But there's been a change of government, so we put in FOIs on this. We think they will. They're very happy to release the data on BMI and how many fat kids we've got. But if your kids are getting shorter and BMI is weight divided by height squared,
what
anyway.
if more intermarriage between different cultures where height is a genetic inherited?
Is that happening? It's fascinating worldwide because actually the average height of children worldwide is falling, but not in any one country. It's rising in every country in the world, but it's falling because the balance of children is there are more children in countries where people are shorter now. That isn't happening in Britain. So we haven't had a big influx of short people. Or, to put it another way, or put my foot in it, we are in Scotland. You lot are not the tallest for various... I have stood 30 years ago at supermarkets in Glasgow. I was exactly 6 foot, I'm now shrinking. And looked across 30 tills, dead straight. So we're not bringing in shorter. Very last slide, which I managed to go back right to start, is the lovely people who say nice things about the book, which I'm going to put up because for ego reasons I'm going to leave you with that, so you've got to think of questions. But what's interesting about them, I didn't know they were going to ask them. The publishers decided to ask, they didn't ask me. And they will have read it, or parts of it, because they don't trust me, put it that way. Or they know a bit what I'm like. Because I supported Labour in the 2017 election campaign, let's put it that way. Right? But Jeff worked for Tony Blair in the number 10. They've missed out Professor Sir Michael, somebody from the Lords, Vicky, Kate and Polly Guardian. There's an interesting kind of almost Victorian morality thing going on of we've just had enough of this. So you can write a book which contains things that are fairly angry, including about previous Labour governments. That is dead easy to kind of about Tories. And no longer do you get people politely saying, oh, I don't think I've got time to give you an endorsement. Right? There is an anger out there because, and that happened 110, 120 years ago as well. You reach a point where eventually you just say, no, you can't have this anymore. So that's what I've been trying, that's why I wrote the book. Why it's full of fictional bits is because I'd like people to read it who don't read non-fiction books. I've got no idea if it works, and I've got no idea what questions you're going to ask me. at all. So please ask anything you want at all. Thank you very much.
Does anyone want to kick off with a question? We'll hear them.
What's the educational opportunities for these children?
Oh, okay, we have them. Now, I've cheated slightly. I'll try to make it easier. They're born in the autumn of 2018. Oh, and they're born on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, different. Anyway, I have the birthdays from I have the newspapers when they're born. So they're only just turning 6 in the next few weeks. They've gone to school. They're all doing state primary. Gemma's parents have an argument about private. They could just about afford private.
Before Labour came in.
The VAT probably wouldn't change it because there's enormous range of private fees. There are really cheap private schools, really expensive private schools. Gemma's family, our richest of 7 children, could afford the cheapest of private schools where they live, which I don't give away, but it's basically near Surrey. But they would have nothing left for anything else, and there's a problem about the second child. Dad really wants it. Really wants his daughter to go with the aspirational people who work hard and get their children in. So they have the biggest dilemma. And interestingly, 3 of my proofreaders about my age, and middle class as most were actually having dilemmas about their children. For the others, it's state primary. I do mainly talking about nurseries and playgroups and can they afford. The theme running through the book is that they're all taking part in the survey for households below average incomes at the Family Resources Survey. So they're all answering the survey questions, which includes can you go to playgroup every week or can you go to nursery? And their answers, some, to the aggregates that are true nationally, but it's real people's lives, talking about filling in surveys, of which the most emotive question is, could you have an annual holiday, just one, for a week, not staying with family or friends? And that's now well over a third, heading to 40% of all children have no annual holiday. Including, and this was to make it work, we have just 2 of the 7, I think, if I can remember. Made it up, so it's not. Anna can't, and Gemma. You might think, how come the richest one can't? Amongst that group there are, because mum and dad are running a corner shop, right? So you always have to have somebody at the corner shop. And there are these differences, so I'm trying to include that variation and to explain, yes, there are people better off than others who can't do certain things.
There was a question there.
It's a question in 2 parts. The first was, I saw one of the graphs, the data went up to 2020. And I was interested, obviously, post-COVID, the impact, obviously, inequality rise even quicker. So if you were to look forward and nothing were to be done, are we seeing an acceleration of what you're describing?
So the latest stats were released on the 31st of March this year, but they relate to the financial year that ended in March 2023. But we kind of know other things, or we know changes that are happening. No, it's almost plateaued. It can't. Well, actually, no, the opposite. So, and it's hinted in the book. I'm a bit cautious. In the very last year, because benefits were put up by inflation at one point 18 months ago, we've actually had our first fall in inequality for decades. It's only just there in the numbers. It could be a blip. It could be a post-corrective COVID thing. Things actually got worse in COVID and it's measured between March and May 2020, a big increase in inequality. But no, there is a sign of a turn. There were all kinds of signs of a turn going on. Pay deals are more successful for people on lower salaries at the moment. But also, people are staying in bigger units so that they can look after each other. So it's like grown-up children are not leaving home, not just because they can't afford to, but that's another salary in the house. I have a grown-up child at home. We have 3 full-time salaries in my house. Makes a huge difference. I'm pretty sure he doesn't really want to live with us, right? But if he were to form his own household, that would actually suddenly create a different distribution. It wouldn't change who's here. And so there's been a lot of huddling together, which makes things not look as bad, but it could be turning. Did you have a second? Okay, thank
I
you.
think there was someone over there, and then maybe we could go over here. Was there someone at the back there?
Do British politicians accept that we are indeed facing a crisis? What do they say to you when you tell them these things? Do they deny it? Do they say your figures are wrong, or what?
Some of their advisors tell me my figures are wrong, and tell me, and I've got it's quoted. Actually, I should be growing up about this, but it is on the record now, because there was a hearing for the Scottish government where some of the advisors for the English politicians actually gave evidence and said that they hadn't seen anything to suggest that the heights of children are falling. Right? So, and that's a stupid thing to say, because you're just revealing your ignorance, unless it's not. So there is a disbelief that it's as bad as people like me say. I think there's a suspicion that people are getting by on the black market. Help from granny and granddad, there'll be something else going on. I think there's a lot of, well, they're not in the gutter actually as skeletons, so they must be finding a way. I think there's a denial, and I think there's quite a lot of simply looking at Institution of Physical Studies Revolution Foundation reports and seeing a graph and not feeling it.
So it sounds like there's a case for Scottish independence and rejoining the EU.
There's always a case for rejoining the EU. I'm going to leave Scottish independence to the Scots. But Scotland has done by far the best. So your interesting academic point is, to what extent was Scotland's incredible success? I'm happy to say that. I mean, it might annoy people here, might go, our services will be, you can't believe how. Measure it, and children are getting taller. As opposed, the interesting question is, to what extent is the success due to the political party in power, or simply due to extreme devolution and that happening, and it would have got better regardless? You could have had right, it's very hard to tell. I happen to like the ministers, but Scotland, the brilliant thing for me about Scotland is you're not going, oh, look at Norway, isn't it wonderful, couldn't we be like them? I sit in Oxford and go to London and go, couldn't we just do the policy they're doing in Scotland? And they go, oh no, that's impossible, it's a different country. Or they're irresponsible. Or it'll damage growth. You know, that thing that supposedly has helped us so much that never comes. I'll be shorter. There's some behind you.
Maybe we could go to you first and then we'll work our way around a bit.
Yeah, I suppose the question is, what are the consequences of all of this?
Yeah.
Because, like, if everything turns out fine and people are fairly equitably distributed in adulthood, does this really matter?
Yeah.
I suppose the second bit of that, and this is something I'm intensely interested in, is what are the correlations and what are the things that are associated with poverty and inequality that are the things that are absolutely instrumental in children's life outcomes in later life. For example, what their early experiences, what the effectiveness of their parenting, the relationship between poverty and inequality. So it's not just about being poor, it's about being poor when other people are not poor.
Yes.
And what difference does that actually make to people's life outcomes?
With that. On the first one, our only guide is look to the past. And we tend to remember the 60s as being good, but that was a middle class 60s. That was the hippies, the people who could get out and do things. So that there is a really obvious long-term legacy that you can measure in terms of health, and that's now baked in. There's nothing we can do about that. But these children who've been this damaged can have children who'll be much less damaged, and you can be out of it within 2 generations. And in a way, the fact that the better off children's families are doing I chart the parents and grandparents at one point later, because it's complicated. And the parents have all been on average worse off than the grandparents in terms of the material things, the house, and the children are said to be worse off. So you're dropping down 3 times, but it could get better. Correlations, it seems like crime. How many are in prison? I have towards the end, there's probably one of these children at one point before they're 18 will have one parent in prison, almost certainly the father. Because an unequal society makes you go, fuck that. I mean, why should I behave when all I am being offered, if I do really well, I can drive a lorry long distances while my partner stacks beans in the supermarket. And all this I'll get, or could do something else, which I might get caught, might not, or I just could get bevied and then commit a crime, which is more likely, and so on. So the drugs, the alcohol, the depression, and most interestingly to me is the effects on the upper middle class and the upper class. And our nicest comparison, because we have the data, is between the UK and the USA. Now remember, we're doing the worst in Europe, but we do so much better than the USA. So it's John Byrne Murdoch who showed this, but it's from the international data. People at every single year of life, I'm a 56-year-old, my chances of making it to 57 are higher than somebody in the USA. Even though their average salaries are higher, I've got a better chance. This goes all the way up until you're high up 90s. By income, somebody on the equivalent income to me in the USA is much more likely to die. And this is not what I'm paid, my position in the hierarchy. They're much more likely to die than me. And again, you get to the top 1% of Americans and they do the same as our top 1%. So all of that wealth is getting them nothing in the end in terms of life expectancy, nothing in the terms of depression or anxiety. They're popping the pills more than anybody else. And the correlations go on and on. If you want to Google a report which came out a month ago, the words just Google spirit level at 15. Spirit level at 15 will give you all the latest correlations of inequality worldwide. The new ones, if you know the spirit level book that they've added, which weren't there, are all with the environment and being green. And they're fascinating because behaviour to do with consumption and the environment, more and more of it is showing that unequal countries are bad in how people behave more widely. Okay?
I think there was some...
There's more behind you.
Do you want to go? Should we go?
Yeah.
Who around here? Yeah?
Sorry, can I be cheeky as too?
Shout, yeah.
So I wondered with the height, the children's height statistic, whether there's other sort of child developmental measures as well, like head circumference,
Like head circumference,
or anything like that.
Oh, that'd be interesting. I don't think that's measured. I mean, these are health surveys for Scotland, health survey for England. So we've had these surveys for ages. I was once on the advisory group because I remember they had the machine where you stand on it and it does your weight and it does your height. And then it puts a small electric current through you to do something else. And I'm a geographer, so I kept on thinking, is it really safe? You know, wouldn't parents get a bit annoyed by the small electric current? So they're measuring different things. Not sure they do head circumference. We do things... We managed to muck other things up more with our education system than they're actually mucked up by our nutrition. So my favourite is maths, where we're at the bottom when it comes to international maths tests. We're near the bottom in Europe at age 24. Or if you just imagine me giving you all some simple maths problems, right? And why are we so bad at maths? Is because we're so good at getting people a C or an A in the old money. What is it now? An 8 or a 7 or a 5. We're so good at getting them a particular mark at 16 that we teach them how to get that and we don't teach them how to do maths. So we actually manage to damage the minds of our children more through our education systems than through starving them so far. No, it's not all bad, but And that shows how easily you can change it by. And why do exam grades matter so much more in this country than others? Because if you muck up your A-levels, which now most children take, and don't end up in university, which now 65% go to by the age of 30, you could be living in families like the 4 of the 7 children. So you do anything you can to stop your children dropping down, whereas in a more normal country, not passing exams doesn't mean parallel lives and never meeting people again.
So can I just, I think it's very linked to what Vera was saying. As a really short person, there's lots of short, high-level graduate children who are even shorter than me. Obviously that's a marker, you'll know much more about that than I am. It's obviously a marker that is used, height.
Yeah.
But how is that a marker? I mean, I don't really...
It's a change in height. It's the change.
But they're shorter. So my consultant daughter is shorter than me.
Yeah.
They're stuffed with food and...
Oh, no, it can be. Okay.
And I'll not
So-
be the only...
yeah.
I'm not speaking as a...
Yeah. So this is about averages. Okay.
Yeah.
So try to explain it. So I've been an academic all my life, which meant for the last 25 years I'm asked to go to university graduations. Some of you have been to your own graduation, your parents have been. Yeah, and you probably enjoyed yourself. Imagine having to put on a gown. I did this at Sheffield, did this at Bristol, did this at Newcastle, did this at Leeds. I've actually avoided doing it at Oxford, and it's really boring. You're sitting there and you're just, you could pay actors to sit there. And it's often hot, so the trick is not to wear much under your gown, because it's summer. What do you do if you're an academic? What you do is you go out afterwards and you look across at the undergraduates and their parents. Because they're mostly, but of course not entirely, genetically related. The women have a better idea than the men, whether they are. But anyway, it's what's going through your mind. We have a height difference of about that still between parents and graduates at universities because we are still getting taller. So height on average improving is a marker of better nutrition. On average, yeah. Not always. There's
Genetics just aren't a factor. Because you get genetically small countries, obviously, of incredibly clever people.
It's not my area of expertise, but it's fascinating. So the highest heights in the world 150 years ago were the USA. That wasn't the genes of who went. It was send us you're poor, you're desperate.
Yeah.
It was farmers and free and able to get tall. When the Kiwis came over in the Second World War, they were incredibly fit and tall. They'd had the welfare states into 30s. The Dutch are now some of the tallest in the world. It's not genetics of the Dutch, it's the background. So your genetics play a much less effect than nutrition and would only play a long-term effect if tall people went for tall people and short people went for short people always. So it kind of balances out. Height is honestly a really nice measure of how you're doing, and much less depressing than the one we normally use, which is infant mortality and children dying.
Yeah.
So infant mortality has got worse and worse in recent years. Children 1 to 4 has got worse. You remember the baby who died in Skegness in January? We hardly know. Even that goes. It was this year he starved to death next to the dead body of his father. Is it coming back again? Okay, here's a story broken by the Sun and the Guardian. His body was found when social workers finally broke in. And then the story they ended with, it's Skegness. Right? The national statistics show that there's been another 60 of those. Okay, so they show it's not just one baby in Skegness who can't get water, can't get food and dies. It's getting worse. And that's depressing. Whereas at least height, and height's also about everybody, whereas these other measures are often about extremely sad situations and more about a minority of people. Okay.
Was there someone? Yeah, that's for you.
Yeah, I was one question about this figure 1. It's the graph with all the averages. It seems like at the bottom there's this particular drop off of,
Yeah.
and I was wondering if that's like reflective of any particular condition in the UK that's...
Yeah, why isn't it completely smooth? It's what is in the survey. We do miss off the very... There are some self-employed people who claim they have a negative income for tax reasons, right? But they're not in there. I think it is mainly people who are not claiming the benefits to which they're entitled.
Right.
So, I'm actually, at the very, very bottom, there are people living with children living on less than they actually could be up. So our safety net is so complicated, they may miss out from it.
Right, okay.
Or just a very bad year where they've had some tax credits clawed back or something else, or they've been sanctioned because they didn't attend a job interview, and so they've actually had their benefits reduced. But it surprised me. It's that kink is what appears in the official
it's a
survey.
smooth curve, and then suddenly it goes like that right at the bottom.
Yeah.
Where
But the other thing to notice from that graph, if you look at the top two lines, you'll see that they can't fit
they're
on.
not covered. Yeah.
No, and the top one, 600, yeah.
Yeah.
And the second one is the Prime Minister. Because when if you remember Johnson complaining about having to live on the Prime Minister's salary, that's because, and it's usually less than what he was living on before. And you can kind of laugh about it, but you could take the surplus unnecessary incomes of the 6% at the top and sort.
Yeah.
Or Scottish child payment appears for children on their own, which is a meaningless thing because they've got families, but for children on their own in Scotland, the money per week moves the Gini coefficient from Scotland from the near to being England to being Finland in a few years. Because people at the bottom have so little money that having a tiny bit more makes a huge effect. Yeah.
Maybe you and then one more over there, and then we might have to wrap it up there.
In today's Britain, with the new government, if there was one thing you could think of that would have the highest impact for a change in wealth inequality, what do you think?
Oh, for wealth, well, this is the other, and that's what they're playing with. We're going to find out this autumn.
I mean, you personally, what do you
You're a new person. Okay. I think the new government is more interesting than I thought it would have been. And I'm left Labour. So you'd expect me to be sceptical of it. It's not just that Starmer did cancel his holiday, but he did. I thought he'd be off to Tuscany, like they mostly are, celebrating. They're doing the things can only get worse song at the moment. You know, if you remember D-Ream, but now everything's going to be more worse than you ever think. Now, a little bit of that may be stage management, but part of it really is that they really did believe the civil service figures, and the civil service were being tricked by the government, and they feel there is less, and they're softening up people for tax changes. And the kind of thing you're talking about are ISAs that allow people like me to avoid paying tax on things, pensions for people like me. I mean, it's lovely being me because I'm one of these well-off people who will be quite happy as long as they do it to all the other people like me. Well, that's all I want. And so they're eyeing up the ways in which those of us at the top avoid paying full tax on some of our incomes. That's the beginning of what they think they have to do. I'll be shocked within a year if they don't reintroduce child benefit for child 3 and 4. They may do something a bit callous about only under a certain level, but it's so unpopular amongst Labour MPs. That makes a change. When it's this bad, really tiny progressive things have a huge impact. It gets harder later. When you've actually got to do things like decide we're going to have free secondary education for all as we had in this country. Or in the 1960s, decide we're not going to have segregation in our state schools anymore, no 11 plus. Right? They were quite hard decisions to make. But changing the trend at the beginning just requires things like, and you might think it's a big thing now, 2 years' time you won't even remember VAT in private schools. Of course they pay VAT on private schools. Tax increases tend to be forgotten within a couple of years of them happening. And what I find intriguing is people saying, but I won't be able to afford for my grandchildren to go to a private school if we have to pay VAT. And I sit there thinking, you wait. You know, you've got no idea what's coming to somebody in your position and the other things that you're doing to hoard the money. Because ultimately this is about greed. This is about a small number of us taking more and more out of a pot that is growing slowly or hasn't grown and telling everybody else, oh, it'll all be okay when the pot gets bigger, as we take so much of it. So, yeah, I'm optimistic about what may happen. I could be proved wrong. But it's... And more, you know, quite a lot in the book are things that are very new statistics, which will filter out and you just can't go back to your constituents every Friday. And remember, Labour MPs are representing the poorest constituencies in the country. You can't go back every Friday and lie to the people who voted you in, no matter how much you might want to become a junior minister later. And luckily, they've got so many MPs that hopefully most MPs will work out that their chances of becoming a minister are so tiny that they might as well stand up for their principles slightly about it. So, yeah. But getting a little bit... And in the past, in other countries, once the trend changes, it tends to carry on. Because when the world doesn't end when you put VAT on private schools, it's just they drop from 7% to 6.5% the kids go. Well, why don't we charge 50% extra VAT on private schools then? Yeah? What else can we do to change society? And why don't we just transfer the money to the state school budget? And why don't we have senior management teams for state schools so that you can move teachers between them, they work together, and you can do more language A-levels in state schools than you can do in a private school? And why don't we have one state school which has the best science labs in the city? And if you go to a state school, you can do science in that state school, rather than go to the rather poorly equipped private school that you're being sent to because your parents really don't want you to be friends with that other person because they're paying for apartheid. Yeah? But you change it by making the state better and not making it as easy for people to pay for their children never to mix. I went to a school where 50, 70 metres away from us there's a wall, and there was Headington High School for girls. And the girls were in Headington High School for girls because they were not supposed to meet us. Because we were so incredibly dangerous. You know, and it's ridiculous, it's sad. And you end up with a set of people growing up fearful for the rest of their lives, no matter how gregarious or party going, or I play rugby with other people, you know. If you are brought up segregated for the rest of your life, you won't quite fit in or feel. It's not good.
There was one more question. Should we do one final question, and then I think we should. We're going to have to sort of run over. So yeah.
You mentioned your optimism that perhaps inequalities have plateaued. Is politics the only catalyst for them to come back down, or are there other factors that may enable things to improve?
Oh, no, it's far from the only factor. I once did a book, I think called Do We Need Inequality? So I've done books with the word inequality in every time. Do we need it? We have a series of graphs to adopt for every general election on trends, showing that almost none of the general elections made any impact on almost anything that happened. You couldn't spot which party had won or lost. The 1918 22 elections may have mattered, and the 1974 October possibly did, not 79. And it's a bit disheartening. So what happens is all our political parties move right, have done since the 70s. All our political parties in the past moved left, so the Tories outdid Labour for building council houses. What you do if you work in a political party and you're on the progressive, left, good side, is it's not just you make your own party better, but if you're successful, you drag the other parties in that direction. So it doesn't matter who wins the election. What matters is how the whole body politics moves. So I went on about Angela Merkel earlier, a German conservative. whose policies were to the left of Jeremy Corbyn. Right? Jeremy never said he was going to let in 1.5 million Syrians. Jeremy had a spending plan under John MacDonald for public spending to be slightly below Germany's even after 5 years of government. Merkel was to the left of Corbyn. German politics is to the left. German society, the income inequality figure for Germany is now almost identical to France. France is the most equal of all the large European countries, and France and Germany sit next to the Nordics. Right? Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Denmark. There are another 6 countries in Europe which are now slightly more equal than them, including Belgium. So you've got this huge block of 15 countries now in Europe who have average northern Nordic levels of inequality. Not perfect. The Link get lots of votes in a tiny state with no immigrants, and we all write papers about it. But this is happening elsewhere, in countries where people go to the same school as each other and don't wear weird uniforms and, you know, do other strange things that we do. So, in us, it hasn't necessarily been everyday politics in the past. Big things like a revolution in Russia probably concentrated minds in rich countries. But there's also a tipping point and an inevitability. There comes a point where the inefficiency caused by inequality is so high, when it wrecks the fabric of your country, when you can no longer even produce steel, where the public services fail, where you end up with a politics that's made worse because you're so unequal, that you don't have a democracy, people don't get what they vote for. So there's a self-reinforcing thing, and eventually it gets so bad it has to tip. But we really ought to avoid that happening. We should try and have some agency, and not say, let's see what happens when that goes down and that goes down, and we'll let those ones go up as some kind of natural experiment for it if we become like Mississippi or Alabama. Right? There's no need to do that. Yeah, trickle down, because the Sunday Tutlands are just round the corner. Yes, and believe my plan for growth. And another Chancellor from St John's College, Oxford, which has a lot to answer for, St John's. Thank you very much.
Yes. I want to make a clarification about what I said in my introduction, which is that when I said it was a depressing book, the reality is depressing. But I think what you can see that Danny does, and what he did with the height thing, and what he did with the story about the man and the baby in this big mess, is you take a statistic and you wrap it in a life, and the life is got all the textures of everyone's lives. It's got their parents who love their kids. You know, it's not kind of poverty porn. So it's very, very readable, but things need to change. And it also did make, I was thinking that this kid would be the super wealthy, because I thought the 7th child is going to be the mega wealthy, but they're not. The 7th kid's pretty normal, you know. And that's what's terrifying, is that it shifts your whole perspective on how one's own relative position and the position of the country. So, Danny's going to dedicate books just around the corner there. If you could put your glasses, there's a table there for your glasses. I'm going to jump on the book sale, so anything you pay tonight, for each place, you get off a copy of 7 Children. So, just, yeah, if you want to do it, do it. And please, can you give Dorling a massive thank you?